to me, O Muse. The Odyssey, an original adaptation written and retold for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 10. The Song of the Sirens. In the great hall of Ithaca, Penelope stood alone. It was just before dawn, the suitors had finally gone home, the servants and house slaves had cleared up all the mess, and now Penelope stood, completely alone. She thought back on the times when she had stood in that hall with Odysseus by her side, of the laughs they'd shared, the plans they had made, the dreams they had hoped to one day make reality. With him she had never felt alone. She turned to look up at the huge tapestry that hung on the wall behind the throne. She had weaved it herself, and it showed Odysseus as she remembered him, young and handsome and hopeful, with a gleam in his eye that was one part genius and one part mischief. The weaving of it had been a stroke of genius her husband would have heartily approved of. When the suitors began arriving in the hall almost 4 years ago, Penelope had told them that she would select her husband when she had finished weaving this tapestry. "My husband's father, old King Laertes, is not long left for this world," she told the suitors. "In readiness for his passing, I would like to weave him this tapestry as a funeral shroud." They had all agreed. Of course, what sort of monsters could refuse such a request? So Penelope had set up her loom and begun her weaving. But it was all a ruse. By day she would make gains, and by night she'd creep into the hall and undo it, painstakingly unpicking the threads to destroy her progress. For 3 years it had held the suitors back from her, as she artfully bluffed and played for time. "I'm just a slow weaver," she had said, and they believed her. Then she'd been betrayed. One of her own house girls had led Antinous and Eurymachus to catch her as she unpicked her work, and the game was up. The suitors sat and watched her from then on, marking her progress every day and chivying her when she wasn't fast enough. She finished the work, but despite them all, she changed her design to the image of Odysseus's face. "Let's see how they like seeing that every day," she had thought. A petty vengeance, but the only one she had. "I wonder if you still look like that," she thought as she gazed up at the face of the husband she had not seen for 20 years. "I wonder if your eyes still sparkle. I wonder if I'll ever see you again to find out." "When will you come home, my love?" she said to the hall. But all she got back were echoes. Far away, in a completely different hall, Odysseus's story was holding half a kingdom in rapt attention. He had just told them the tale of his visit to the land of the dead, which he had thought would be too much for them to believe. But it seemed the audience were struggling more with his next claim. "You mean to tell me," asked Alcinous, king of the Phaeacians, "that you're claiming to be the only mortal in the world to have heard the song of the Sirens and live?" "Well, I don't claim to have asked every mortal," said Odysseus, "but as far as I know, I'm the only one, yes." "Nonsense," said the king. "It can't be done. No one hears the song of the Sirens and resists." "Well, in that case," said Odysseus, "I'm sure you won't want to know how I did it." He turned to sit down, and the whole room sent up groans of disappointment. Queen Arete leapt out of her seat. "No, don't stop," she cried out. "We want to hear the story." She rounded on her husband and hissed, "Do shut up, Alcinous, and let the man tell the tale." Odysseus grinned at her widely, reclaimed his place in the centre of the hall, and remembered. On leaving the land of the dead, Odysseus and the last remaining Ithacan ship had set their course and sailed towards the island of the Sirens. They had all heard the stories, of course, every sailor had, an island of seemingly beautiful creatures who lured sailors onto the rocks with their songs and feasted on their flesh. "How do I keep from hearing the songs?" Odysseus thought, as their ship cut through the morning mists. Then a smaller, much more curious thought arose. "I wonder what it sounds like." He should have dismissed this thought. He should have stamped it out and thrown it aside, but instead he let it play on his mind. The song of the Sirens. He was just musing on this when a strange sight met his eyes. Bobbing towards him on the water, emerging out of the fog, was a small flotilla of trading vessels. They were lashed together, with gangplanks in between each boat, and there was a hustle and bustle of activity as traders called their wares and people ran between the small boats buying goods. It looked for all the world like a floating market, cried Eurylochus, completing his thought. It's a floating market! Indeed, it was a floating market, and as soon as the traders saw the Ithacan ship, they started calling out their wares for the Ithacans to buy. Fresh vegetables, cried one. Salted pork, yelled another. Best salted pork. Rope, cried a third. Get your rope here. Odysseus was ignoring most of it, letting his mind roll over the problem of the Sirens. Surely no song can be that tempting, he asked himself, when another voice called out. It was quieter than the others, but it cut clean through the noise. Wax, said the voice. Get your wax here. Odysseus's head span round and he locked onto the source of the sound. The trader was staring back at him with cool grey eyes the colour of raw silver, and they were smiling softly. It's got a million uses. The trader smiled again and winked up at Odysseus. There was a shimmer in the air across the water, and he had an idea. A short time later, the market now behind them, Odysseus was addressing the Ithacans as they sailed on. We all know the dangers if you hear the siren song, so you're not gonna hear it. He held up a blob of freshly bought wax. I'm gonna plug each of your ears with this so no one can hear them, he said. That way we'll all stay safe. Oh, said Eurylochus, so that's why you bought the wax. But why did you buy all that rope too? The rope's for me, replied Odysseus. I want to see if this song is worth all the stories. So Odysseus made sure each man had wax earplugs ready and instructed the men to tie him to the mast as tightly as they could manage, and the Ithacans sailed on towards the deadly island. At first he heard nothing, just the lapping of the sea, the sound of the sail in the wind and the creak of the ship. But eventually he heard a sound. It whispered across the water, a soft, playful melody, simple and slow, but the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It wrapped itself around him, and though it had no words, Odysseus could swear it spoke to him. All your sadness, all your pain, all your loneliness, we can make it go away. The song was louder now, but that only seemed to make it all the sweeter. In Odysseus's brain it was like there were two of him, a tiny one that knew it was all a deadly trap, and a much larger one who didn't care and wanted to hurl himself towards oblivion. No more pressure, no more responsibility, no more people, just peace, just pleasure. The song had a stranglehold on his mind now, and his body was starting to follow. He wrenched and twisted at the ropes around him, but they wouldn't give way. All he wanted to do was tear free and heave himself from the ship towards that incredible sound and the promises it made. Stop all the feelings, stop all the worrying, stop all the thinking, just this, just us. The ship was level with the island now, and Odysseus could see shapes moving on its surface. They were the most beautiful figures he had ever seen, and he wanted desperately to be with them. At that moment, he would have torn his arm clean away from his body if it only meant he could get free. Twisting, heaving, he finally pulled a hand loose and gave a cry of triumph. Frantically, he began working at the other knots, but a strong hand grabbed him and held him back. Looking round, he saw Eurylochus holding his arm, and Perimedes lashed it down with more ropes and tightened the knots. "You fools!" Odysseus yelled at them. "I have to get free! I have to get to the island!" Tears were streaming down his face now as he thought of missing out on the source of the siren song. "You traitors!" he yelled to the men. "You cowards and traitors! I'll have you flogged! I'll have you killed!" But of course they couldn't hear him. The wax in their ears saw to that. Stretching, Odysseus longed to catch a glimpse of the magnificent island and the marvellous creatures it contained. But the ship was passing by now, and the island was almost behind them. Odysseus could still hear the song, that honey-sweet song, as it crept up and down his spine. He craned his neck to see them, and strained with all his strength against his bonds. If he could just see them one last time, he knew it would be enough. Surely it would be enough. "It will never be enough," said the little voice inside his mind that was still him. But the rest of him paid no attention to that as he lurched his body to see them once again. A rough hand grabbed his face and forced it back. His eyes met Perimedes, and the sailor opened his mouth and said just one word. Penelope. It wasn't instant. The song of the Sirens was still in the air, and it enslaved his mind. But it was like Perimedes had heaped fuel on a tiny fire within him, and now it began to burn. The small part of him that was still himself, that had always been himself, took comfort from that fire and grew strong. Gradually, oh so gradually, Odysseus recovered his senses. The ship was past the island now, and the siren song was less than a whisper. Odysseus looked Perimedes in the eye and nodded. Perimedes nodded back, and the men began to remove the waxed plugs from their ears. Behind him, Eurylochus untied Odysseus, and he slumped down the mast in utter exhaustion. He felt like he'd been in pitched battle for hours on end. His voice was raw from the shouting, and deep cuts and burns were around his wrist where he'd fought his bonds. His stupid, senseless curiosity had almost cost him his life, and now he would have the scars to prove it. He looked up at his men, the ones who'd kept him safe and kept their senses when he lost his. "Thank you," he told them. It would never be enough, but it was all he had right now. He leant his head back against the mast and thought of Penelope. In the great hall at Phaeacia, Odysseus looked down on the scars and his wrists and arms still livid despite the years. "I believe I am the only mortal to have heard the song of the Sirens and lived to tell the tale," he told the room, "and that is for good reason. But of all the dangers I have faced, the worst, by far, is my own curiosity. When channeled well, it's a powerful tool. When left idle, it's deadly."
"But Penelope," radiated Queen Arete, "Penelope was the thought that returned you to your senses."
She beamed at Odysseus, and in that moment, Odysseus saw the young woman she used to be, full of love and passion and dreams of romance. Odysseus could tell Alcinous saw it in her too. In fact, it looked like he'd never stopped seeing it since the day he met her. "Indeed, my lady," Odysseus said. "She always has been the better part of my heart, and always will be. I long to get back to her. I fear for her safety and that of my son without me." That fear, it turns out, was well placed.